chambers of commerce. We got a broader view of what the perceptions were. We then honed into the sectors which had issues with trade with India, which felt threatened. And these were agriculture, as I said, automobile, and pharmaceutical. So what's the issue with agriculture? Put it very briefly, it's essentially an issue of restricted market access, which comes through generally higher Indian tariffs on agriculture. Secondly, the wide range of subsidies which Indian government gives to its farmers. Okay, irrigation, subsidy, you have subsidies on fertilizer, subsidy on pesticide, credit subsidies, price support systems, all that. Pakistan has relatively liberalized its regime in agriculture. There's only one crop, which is wheat, which gets a government support price, which is procured by the government. The others are on market rate. Subsidies have also been gradually removed. If you look at this overall trade restrictiveness index and compare sort of India and Pakistan in agriculture relative to manufacturing, you see that in agriculture, India is far more restrictive. This overall trade restrictiveness is around 69.5%. Pakistan is much lower, which is 5.8%. Now, what are the solutions? And this we got after a series of focal group sessions with the various agricultural associations. Dr. Tariq Bucha is here. He knows how those meetings were. So there are solutions to this. This need not be an impediment to Pak-India trade. Okay? So how do you solve this? Well, first, you have a bilateral agreement or a separate agreement on agriculture. You adopt what NAFTA did. Okay? So NAFTA model is that US, Mexico have a separate agreement on agriculture. They have quota cum tariff rates. They allow goods just to control prices of important food items, and then beyond a certain point, a level, they impose tariff rates, tariff duties. So that is one. The other is sensitive list. The question is, if you put agricultural items on the sensitive list, it's going to crowd out a limited sensitive list. Then transitional safeguard measures is also something which one can think of. But seriously, the first proposal, the NAFTA sort of way of doing it, having a separate agreement on agriculture, is something which both countries should look at. And when the agricultural panel talks about this, this is perhaps something which they can talk more on. Auto sector. So what's the issue? India's automobile industry is much more competitive, much larger scale of production, scale economies, cost per units are much lower relative to Pakistan. So obviously the Pakistan sector feels threatened. Pakistan, in the 2-3 wheelers, interestingly, there's a feeling that Pakistan has a competitive advantage, but the issues are NTBs. Those which have been put down or given to us were homologation requirements, emission standards, and high tariff barriers. In terms of quality standards, India has moved to Euro 3, Euro 4. Pakistan is still from Euro 1 going on to Euro 2. What are the solutions, proposed solutions? A win-win situation is FDI, joint ventures. Okay, invite Indian OEMs, they should come invest in Pakistan, assembly plants in Pakistan, so you create jobs in the country, you supply a cheaper product. If you want to have automobile on the sensitive list, it has to be time bound. And it has to be contingent in terms of technology transfer and so on. Third proposal which was put forward, also look at this sector bilaterally, have bilateral negotiations to create win-win situations. Again, this is something which will be discussed. And finally, the pharmaceutical sector. So I'll be very brief here. The issue with the pharmaceutical sector, interestingly, is internal. The pharmaceutical sector is importing chemicals, inputs from India. It sees India as a market. But its issue is that Pakistan regulates prices. So there's price regulation in so their point is very valid. They say, well, if you want to liberalize, how can you liberalize externally, in a sense deregulate externally, while you have regulations on prices internally? That doesn't make sense. So their proposition, or what they were proposing, was deregulation of prices. That's going to increase their margins, that's going to increase investment within the sector, increase scale, and then they would be able to compete better. But what do you do till Pakistan deregulates and regulates on quality instead? The fear was that Indian large pharmaceutical companies which comply to international standards, they're not interested in Pakistan. It's the smaller companies with suspect quality which would be interested in Pakistan. So Pakistan internally has quality issues in terms of drug manufacturing, then that will be compounded with these drugs coming from India. So that was the fear. What's the solution to this? Well, first is an internal one, deregulation of domestic drug prices and regulation and quality. The second is the Bangladesh model. The Bangladesh model is those drugs which are approved by Europe and North America, those pharmaceutical companies which export to North America and Europe, they should be allowed to export to Pakistan, just to take care of the quality issue and this fear that you have spurious drugs coming in. Also, internally in the domestic market, because you have spurious drugs being manufactured in Pakistan, also to have quality standards imposed internally too. If you want to do it externally, then have the domestic market also to comply by that. Okay. So I'm sorry I took more time than what was given to me. As I said, this thing I can never predict. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Turab. Both Nisha and Turab have set the scene, and they have also highlighted the challenges and opportunities and proposed solutions. And Turab mentioned Bangladesh model, and that's why now we are referring to Dr. Salim Rehan. So while both Nisha and Turab, they presented the stakeholder analysis and perception, Salim is sharing his CG modeling work with us. And as I said, it's a distant spectator and more scientific evidence. So let's hear from him. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Suluri. I thank ICRIER for inviting me to this very important conference. And I think it's a great opportunity for me to present some of the recent work I have done with my co-authors. I'm not sure Probir Dev whether he's here. But actually there are two recent studies on India-Pakistan. First one is the World Bank study, which I did with Probir Dev and Azaz Ghani. What does MFN mean for India and Pakistan? Is MFN a panacea? And then the second one is for the Commonwealth Secretariat, India-Pakistan Economic Cooperation, Implications for Regional Integration in South Asia. Actually, the whole idea is to understand what could be the areas for issues for extended economic cooperation between these two countries, and also whether when a couple of years back the MFN issue actually really popped up again, and now still it is very much on, then to what extent that MFN issue is important for these two countries, and whether it's a panacea or it's only the solution, or you need to do something more to actually enhance the trade cooperation between these two countries. So as Dr. Suluri said, I have a bit of expertise on economic modeling, so that technique I have applied here, and I'll try to present to you the results of those exercises and to see whether those results make sense. I'm not really going into the background because Nisha and Turab, they're really excellent, in an excellent way, they presented the background. So, but what I'll try to say, that if you look at the composition of India's export to Pakistan and Pakistan's export to India, one interesting observation is that increasingly it is becoming concentrated. For example, India's top 15 exports to Pakistan in 2000, the share was around 64%. Now in 2010, it is close to almost 80%, the 15 products. And if you even look at Pakistan's top 15 exports to India, in 2000, they had a share of 41% around. Now in 2010, it is almost close to 80%. So that really brings the idea, these two countries actually, especially I think it's very important for Pakistan to diversify its export base. I think this is something very important when you talk about the complementary issue, when you talk about enhancing the intra-industry trade between these two countries. Little bit background in terms of the trade regimes in India, Pakistan. Don't get angry with me on the first statement when I say the trade between India and Pakistan is restricted by closed trade regime. It's not an absolute closeness, it is more of a relative closeness. But actually I think already Turab has presented that the World Bank's trade restrictive index showed that these two countries actually at the higher rank in terms of trade restrictiveness. So still these two countries need to do a lot in terms of liberalizing their trade regime, despite the fact that actually over the last 20 years or so, they liberalized they reduced their tariff. In the face of restricted trade policy and transport bottlenecks, there is a large bilateral informal trade, which varies from $500 million to about $1 billion. I'm not sure whether I missed whether Nisha and Turab both, they really touched on these two bilateral informal trade, but I think it's very, very important. And in our papers, actually, we mentioned what are the channels of informal trade through Dubai, through land border. There are many, many areas. So I think these are the things which actually really happening in the presence of less cooperation in terms of formal trade. High tariffs still exist on some specific goods. Despite the fall in average tariffs, trade restrictions of both India and Pakistan have been heavily triggered by the large volume of NTBs. And of course, the trade facilitation is not well developed. Now, in terms of looking at the trade complementary, I tried to present to you the revealed comparative advantage of these two countries. Actually, this is the more the aggregate trade. It's a total trade, not at the bilateral one. But if you look at Pakistan, between 2005 and 2010, actually number of products exported to the world increased, and number of products having RCA greater than 1, actually they increased, though there is a little bit of decline in the percentage share in total export from 23 to 22, but actually the number of products having RCA greater than 1 is increased. For India as well, it's increased. But when it comes to, but that is not very much reflected in the bilateral trade when it comes to export from Pakistan to India. Despite the fact that India still is not enjoying the MFN status, but India's export to Pakistan has increased. I think market force and the other things, the price issue is also very important. But I think there is a scope for large, complementarity in trade, and that is also reflected in the trends in the complementarity between India and Pakistan. This is a bilateral trade complementary index. And of course, India is having a high complementarity. By complementarity, I mean to what extent the country's export is matched with import in the bilateral context. And there has been some improvement in as far as Pakistan's trade complementarity with India is concerned. But still, our studies have tried to show that there are large scopes for increasing this complementarity. So as I mentioned at the beginning, actually these studies tried to look at using some sophisticated techniques, the CG, computable general modeling techniques, to see to what extent the MFN scenario can have some impact on these two countries, and whether MFN is the only solution or we need to do something more. So what we did, actually, we used global trade analysis project GTAP model. It's a global model, and we simulated that. But it was a bit complicated or tricky to construct the MFN scenario. Actually, the way I tried to construct it, actually, I looked at the trade data at the 6-digit HS code from the World Bank's WITS database, and tried to see which are the products which fall into Pakistan's negative list while importing from India, but actually India has a sort of price advantage or competitiveness in those products. So actually, if Pakistan could import from India, or if the imports were sourced from India, then there could be a fall in import price. So comparing the price of those products, actually I could identify 561 products at the 6-digit HS code, where Pakistan's, the unit cost of imports, if they are sourced from India, would be lower than the unit cost of imports if they are sourced from other countries. Now, these 561 products were matched into GTAP 57 products classification. Actually, I should say 57 because there are some services products. So actually, they were matched into 42 goods products in GTAP, and then using the respective weights. And then in the GTAP model, there was a MFN simulation where actually this difference in prices were introduced as shock in the model in a productivity parameter. The way it will, if they are imported from India, that will lead to fall in the prices of import for those products. And also, since the study also tried to look at what would be the impact for the other South Asian countries, we thought that it is definitely a debatable issue. It's a very much subjective. We thought that giving MFN status to India and also having some external economic cooperation between these two countries, that will have some peace dividend to other South Asian countries as well. So other South Asian countries will also be benefited from that one. I'm not really going into the impact on other South Asian countries, so try to focus on India and Pakistan. Actually, we ran several scenarios. The first was the MFN scenario. Second was a very hypothetical MFN plus India-Pakistan bilateral FTA. Then MFN plus India-Pakistan bilateral FTA. There's a welfare effect for both India and Pakistan, and actually as you move from simple FTA or MFN to integrate with trade facilitation, the gains are much larger for both India and Pakistan. And you can see in an absolute term, of course, India's gains are larger, but when it comes to as a percent of GDP, 3 minutes? Okay. When it comes to percentage of GDP, actually, Pakistan's gains are larger than India's. So, in brief, we'll also look at the impacts on exports and imports. The results suggest that simple MFN status is, of course, it is very much beneficial to both India and Pakistan. But when it comes with improvement in trade facilitation, the bilateral exports and imports, they increase by manifold. So this is something what we figured out. And also at the sectoral level, I just want to mention the sectors which will really benefit from this type of scenarios. For Pakistan, for India, export to Pakistan in the sector of processed food like meat, or chemical, rubber and plastic, food processing, mineral fuels, metals, machinery equipment, textile, leather products, dairy products, fishing, etc. And for Pakistan to export to India, there would be like exports of plant-based fibers, animal products, metals, and also wool, wheat, textile, wearing apparels, leather products, metals, machineries, chemicals, etc. So in brief, what we try to do in our paper, we try to elaborate a lot on these issues, but in very brief, I would like to highlight 3 major policy issues. First one is the tariff rationalization and removal of NTBs. Actually, we heard in the morning that there are issues of non-tariff barriers, and I think it's very important that we need to be very objective in understanding what are the on these non-tariff barriers. It's not very emotional issues. I think it's very much need to be very, very objective. Actually, very recent study in a South Asian context with a team of South Asian experts, they found that there is a lot of non-tariff barriers when it comes to regional trade in South Asian. Actually, what I try to say that it's non-tariff barrier, but in many cases it's a no trade mindset, or when it called to non-tariff measures. So I think it's very much important to identify those non-tariff barriers, and then these countries, they can really look into this and to rationalize also the import duties. Then, of course, I think what we try to highlight that the trade facilitation improvement in connectivity. So this is something there is a need to support trade facilitation to complement the trade liberalization. And we showed that the CG modeling exercise, there are large gains from reduction in transaction costs through trade facilitation. And the trade between India and Pakistan is constrained by the poor condition of infrastructure, congestion, high cost, and lengthy delays. And these problems are particularly severe at the India-Pakistan border crossings. And finally, I think this is something very important. I was really glad this morning hearing Mr. Secretary also highlighting that issue, the regional supply chain or identifying the supply chain. I think allowing FDI to narrow the trade gap and also to promote the supply chain is very important. Here I can mention some of the recent studies on who really identified there are potentials for regional supply chain in the areas of textile clothing, in the areas of leather, in the areas of agro-processing industries. I think these are the areas where these 2 countries should